next, I would love to introduce Sarah Miller and Alexandar Gard-Murray, who had some really, really interesting things to say about heat pumps versus air conditioning and how cooling solutions can actually perhaps be an entry point into thinking about including vulnerable households in decarbonizing heating at home. But I don't want to give away too much. Take it away, Sarah and Alexandra. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thanks for having us on this. It's a real privilege to be part of this conversation alongside so many extremely effective advocacy groups and organizers. So it's great to be part of this. Alex and I will just speak briefly about some of our research that we've done on heat pumps as a cooling solution and some of the barriers that are holding a lot of households back, particularly lower income households, from being able to access these technologies. Next slide, please, Alex. So really briefly, I'm sure many people are familiar with the basics of heat pumps, but just to cover them really quickly. So heat pumps are a home heating and cooling technology that we're seeing being adopted across Canada increasingly. And they operate basically by moving heat. They use electricity to move heat from one space to another, rather than generating heat. So in the winter, heat pumps provide heating by drawing heat from the outside air and pumping it into indoor spaces. And then in the summer, they operate in the reverse, so they can extract thermal energy from the indoor air and move it outdoors. So this allows them both to operate as a heating system and as a cooling system, as an air conditioner. So they provide heating and cooling in one device, in one unit. Heat pumps are extremely efficient. So we see that heat pumps can operate at 2 to 5 times the efficiency of even the most efficient alternatives, like the newest gas furnaces. And as a result of this extreme efficiency, heat pumps produce significant savings on energy bills for most households, which is something that Alex will talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. Next slide, please, Alex. So heat pumps are, we think, an essential tool in both dealing with the consequences of climate change, as well as in helping us avoid, further significant negative consequences by helping us decarbonize our home and building stock. As many people have spoken about already, obviously we're in an era where climate impacts are worsening and worsening quickly. And extreme heat, we know, is the deadliest climate-related disaster. And we've already seen it take far too many lives in Canada just in recent years. So we urgently need policies and technologies that protect people from these impacts. And we know, as many have spoken eloquently to already, that space cooling can no longer be seen as a nice to have. It's a necessity and a life-saving necessity. This is not to say that other measures aren't also important. So we know that things like building design, urban greening, measures to provide cooling in public spaces are all important, but we know from our research and the research that others have done that mechanical cooling has to be a key part of the puzzle to keep people safe in their homes. And heat pumps are a technology that are uniquely well suited to meeting this dual challenge of adapting to existing climate impacts and helping us meet our net zero targets. Because they have the same ability to cool as air conditioners, and because they significantly reduce energy and emissions from home heating. So they do this so they're able to provide protection from extreme heat in a way that doesn't actually make the problem worse. Whereas we know that when households buy new air conditioners, they tend to get locked into existing fossil fuel heating infrastructure, whereas heat pumps free them from that while also providing cooling. So in terms of the main barriers that are holding households back, and particularly renter households and lower income households, we've assessed a number of barriers that are still preventing wider uptake of this technology, though we are seeing that uptake has accelerated in recent years. So first of all, heat pumps are still a relatively unfamiliar technology for many households. And so we see this manifesting in the fact that consumer confidence is still undermined by a lack of familiarity with this technology and somewhat unclear information. So there are still information gaps that persist around heat pump performance and cost. And people might get contradictory advice and information from different contractors, different sources that they look at online around whether a heat pump could work for them. And exacerbating this challenge is the fact that often heating and cooling replacement decisions are made with quite a high degree of urgency when existing equipment fails, which makes it a lot harder to make a decision to install a technology that might be relatively less familiar with or that people might perceive as risky. The second barrier that we've identified is to do with higher upfront costs. So even though, as Alex will speak to, we know that heat pumps produce significant savings on energy bills, they do still have higher upfront costs than alternative traditional air conditioning or heating systems. And this is a significant barrier, in particular for lower income households who might not be able to bear the higher upfront cost while they wait for the savings to accrue through lower operating costs. Next point, please, Alex. Also, so thirdly, there is a significant amount of programming that exists at different levels of government. As I'll speak to in a minute, it doesn't capture all households equally, but it's also for the households that are eligible. It's extremely complex often. It forces households to navigate multiple levels of government, different eligibility criteria in terms of equipment, different timelines for getting reimbursed. And also most programs require that households carry the cost until and through the installation process and then get reimbursed after the fact. So this is obviously a psychological barrier for all households who have to deal with the uncertainty of whether they'll actually be approved after already spending a significant amount of money. And again, it's a particular barrier for lower income households who may just not be able to carry this cost. And then finally, we also see significant structural barriers that limit access for many households. This is, of course, most relevant to the conversation that we're having today. So in particular, renter households and people who don't live in single-family homes are often ineligible for existing programs. This isn't true across the board, but many of the most significant programs at the federal and provincial levels target owner-occupied households and single detached homes. So if you live in a condo or if you're a renter, your landlord may not be eligible for the rebate programs, even if they are motivated to install a heat pump. And also the fact that for renter households, many of the issues come from the fact that there are misaligned incentives between the tenants and the landlords, where renters typically pay the energy bills and landlords typically pay for the installation of heating systems and cooling systems. So there's misaligned incentive to have the landlord expend extra money at the outset when the benefits in terms of lower energy bills tend to accrue to the occupants. So as a result of these structural barriers, we know that many of those who might be the most vulnerable to extreme heat, as well as to rising energy bills, are actually currently the least able to reap the benefits of making the switch to a heat pump. And Alex, I will pass it over to you to talk about some of our research results.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So Sarah just told you about what makes heat pumps great and what barriers have slowed adoption. And I want to talk to you about how heat pumps intersect with the discussion we've been having today about expanding active cooling. Right? As people talked about, there's a real need to expand active cooling in Canada, which is crucial to protecting people, especially low-income people, from the effects of extreme heat. The question we have is, what technology are we going to use to meet that need for cooling? And basically, the claim we make in our report is that if we rely on air conditioning, we're missing a big opportunity. And that's because air conditioning and heat pumps, not only can heat pumps cool, but AC and heat pumps are basically the same machines, especially when we're talking about the most basic common models that are most likely to be available to low-income households. They're literally mechanically almost the same machine, with the difference just being valves that allow the machine to change the direction that it's pumping heat in. So all the benefits that Sarah was talking about, reduced bills, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, are locked behind this really small additional cost to make an air conditioner and a heat pump for manufacturers. So it's about a few $100s to make a heat pump instead of an air conditioner. And when that gets to the consumer, that's about a $700 difference for like a common unit that many people would be buying. But that small upfront difference really matters in the long run. And so we did a modeling exercise looking across Canada at homes with different kinds of heat, different kinds of existing heat, and said, what if they got a heat pump instead of a central air conditioner next time they replaced their central air conditioner? What would the effects of that be? And before I show the modeling, I just want to remark that the stakes of this question, whether people get ACs or heat pumps, are really high, because right now in Ontario, last year, there were 8,000 new ducted heat pumps installed the whole year, but there were 4,000 ducted air conditioners installed each week. And because these pieces of equipment last for so long, if you get a new ducted AC, that's going to last for the next 15, 20 years. You're locking yourself out of that decision. And renters who don't get to pick their HVAC equipment, as Sarah mentioned, are getting locked out without even realizing or having control over that. So when we modeled these effects, we modeled them for all of Canada, but I'm going to talk specifically about some impacts we modeled in Ontario. So looking ahead to 2030, so we model it for each year with a changing electricity grid. We see substantial bill savings for houses, regardless of what kind of system they're currently using for heat, which you can use alongside the heat pump. So houses using electric heating see the biggest savings, over $1,000 per year, but even households using efficient gas appliances tend to be the lowest cost heating model now, would see savings from using a heat pump, because the heat pump can take on some of that heating load when it's cost effective to do so. We also see major greenhouse gas emission savings. So as Sarah mentioned, part of the conflict is that just installing cooling adds demand to the grid, but doesn't actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But the efficiency of heat pumps means that depending on your existing system, you're going to be saving tons of CO2 emissions for all the households that install this. And these benefits are going to be really large when they accrue over time. So if we required new AC to be heat pumps instead, if we essentially required AC to have a heating capability, that would be $2.6 billion in additional upfront costs over the next decade, but that would produce more than $7 billion of energy bill reductions over the same period. And it would produce another $4 billion in terms of climate benefits converted to money using the social cost of carbon. And that's equivalent to 3.7 million more heat pumps installed and 13.7 million metric tons of emissions reductions. So these are major benefits which are on the table if we get heat pumps installed instead of AC. And again, that $2.6 billion at the front looks like a large number and is a large number, but for individual households, we're really talking about a pretty small cost delta. We're talking about $700 per unit, an amount that the government is well placed to cover, either for consumers directly or upstream. So we talk in our report about different ways of implementing this, and I'll get to that in a second. But I just want to emphasize that these bill savings are obviously going to be really important for those facing energy poverty. Making sure that only heat pumps are available instead of AC guarantees that renters get this technology, even though they can't control their HVAC decision. If the landlord has to get a heat pump and make sure they get access to that. And of course, as I said, the government still needs to ensure upfront affordability. The report, I'll post a link to it at the end, but it's called The Cool Way to Heat Homes. And we lay out a few different ways you could implement a regulation like this. But briefly, you could just have a national mandate that said that all central air conditioners in Canada also have to have heating capability. You could have local governments use performance standards and building codes to say that air conditioners have to have heating capability. Vancouver has already done this and found it to be successful. And also the federal or provincial government could offer upstream incentives to manufacturers or distributors to stop selling ducted ACs and sell heat pumps instead. But whichever route you take, making sure that low-income people aren't locked out of this important new technology is going to be really important for achieving LEED's goals of expanding cooling access while also maintaining energy affordability. Thank you very much.